The notification from my bank app appeared at 7:23 a.m., just as I was ladling grits into Ethan's bowl for breakfast. Unusual account activity. Unauthorized withdrawal to the $847. My hand froze midair, wooden spoon dripping, while my 12-year-old grandson hummed a Kendrick Lamar song and scrolled through his tablet. "Grandma Dorothy, you all right?" Ethan's voice carried that careful concern children develop when they've watched too many adults struggle. At 68, I'd survived integration at Alabama State, 3 decades, teaching in Detroit public schools, and raising 2 children as a widow. But nothing had prepared me for discovering that Melissa, my late son David's widow, had been systematically draining Ethan's trust fund. I set the spoon down with deliberate, calm years of classroom management, keeping my voice steady. "Just checking something, baby. Eat your breakfast." But my fingers moved quickly across the phone screen, navigating to the full transaction history. There it was, clear as Sunday morning automatic transfers, each under $3,000, to avoid bank alerts stretching back 6 months. Professional, calculated, patient theft from a dead man's child. "Mrs. Dorothy, you ready for church?" Diane's voice called through the screen door. My next-door neighbor had been my closest friend since we'd both moved to this West Side Chicago block in 1987, 2 young widows determined to create stability for our children. "Come on in!" I called back my voice, betraying nothing while my mind raced. Diane's footsteps approached the kitchen, her Sunday heels clicking against my hardwood floors. "Morning, Ethan." She greeted my grandson with the warmth reserved for children we'd helped raise collectively. "You ready to hear Pastor Williams preach about abundance today?" Ethan grinned, dimples flashing in a face that perfectly blended his father's gentle features with his mother's sharp intelligence. "Yes, ma'am. But Grandma's looking at her phone like somebody did something wrong." Children see everything. I'd learned that truth teaching 8th grade for 31 years, watching 13-year-olds navigate situations that would challenge adults. Now my own grandson was developing those same survival instincts, reading adult moods for signs of approaching storms. "Just bank business," I said, finally looking up. Diane caught my eye, and her expression sharpened with the intuition of a friendship spanning 3 decades. "Ethan, baby, run upstairs and make sure you got your Bible," Diane suggested gently. "Your grandma and I need to discuss some grown folk matters." Once his footsteps disappeared up the stairs, Diane settled into the chair across from me. At 72, she remained formidable, silver hair, impeccably styled church dress pressed with military precision. During the civil rights era, she'd organized voter registration drives in Mississippi before moving north. She understood battles that required both strategy and stamina. "What's wrong?" she asked without preamble. I turned my phone toward her, watching her face transform as she absorbed the transaction history. Diane's fingers adorned with the wedding ring she'd never removed despite 40 years of widowhood traced the screen with growing indignation. "That heifer been stealing from David's baby." Her voice dropped to the dangerous whisper she'd perfected during decades of church committee meetings where decorum battled righteous fury. "How long this been going on?" 6 months, looks like. Always under 3,000, always to accounts I don't recognize." I scrolled further back, discovering the pattern extended beyond what I'd initially seen. "Diane, she's taken almost $40,000 from that boy's future." David had established the trust meticulously after his diagnosis with cancer 2 years ago, naming me and his sister Emma as trustees, specifically to prevent this type of exploitation. The monthly distributions were meant for Ethan's care, education, and activities, while the principal remained protected until his 25th birthday. "You got to call the police," Diane said immediately, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd taught Sunday school for 50 years and knew right from wrong without hesitation. But I was already thinking 3 steps ahead, considering complications Diane hadn't yet recognized. "She's been living in David's house since he passed, taking care of Ethan. Technically, she has legitimate access for his expenses." $40,000 worth of expenses. Diane's eyebrow arched toward her hairline. "Child, please. That woman's been scheming since the funeral. The funeral. I remembered Melissa's behavior during those terrible days last September, how quickly she'd shifted from grief to practicality, asking about insurance policies before we'd even selected David's casket. At the time, I'd attributed it to shock different people processing loss in different ways. Now those memories took on a darker significance. "Grandma, I can't find my Bible." Ethan's voice carried down the stairs, innocent and trusting, in a world where adults were supposed to protect rather than exploit. "Check the drawer in your nightstand," I called back, then lowered my voice to continue with Diane. "I need to understand the full scope before I do anything. If she's been stealing, what else has she been doing?" Diane nodded, following my logic with the sharp intelligence that had made her a formidable community organizer. "You need evidence, documents, proof that goes beyond bank records. And I need to protect Ethan," I added quietly. "If this becomes a legal battle, that boy's going to be caught in the middle. He's already lost his daddy. I can't let him lose his sense of security, too." "Found it," Ethan announced, appearing in the doorway, with his children's study Bible clutched against his chest. At 12, he was at that awkward age where childhood and adolescence battled for dominance, his voice occasionally cracking when he got excited or upset. "Good," I said, standing and smoothing my navy dress with hands that betrayed none of the turmoil churning in my chest. "Let's head to New Hope. Pastor Williams is preaching from Ecclesiastes today about there being a time for everything. A time for every purpose under heaven," I thought as we prepared to leave, including a time for justice. The drive to New Hope Baptist Church provided 20 minutes to process what I'd discovered. Ethan chattered about his upcoming science project, his words washing over me as I navigated familiar streets lined with the mixture of gentrification and neglect that characterized changing neighborhoods throughout Chicago. New Hope sat at the corner of Madison and Kedzie, a brick structure built in 1923 that had anchored this community through segregation integration, white flight, and urban renewal. I'd been a member for 35 years, serving on the trustee board, coordinating the annual scholarship fund, and teaching Sunday school until David's diagnosis consumed my attention. "Morning, Sister Dorothy," called out Mother Jenkins as we approached the church steps. At 83, she remained New Hope's unofficial greeter, her memory sharp enough to recall every member's family drama and prayer requests going back decades. "How you doing, Ethan baby?" "Fine, thank you," Ethan replied, with the manners I'd drilled into him since he could speak. Politeness was armor in a world that judged black children by different standards, a lesson I'd learned raising David and Emma in the 1980s and 90s. Inside the sanctuary hummed with the comfortable energy of a congregation that had weathered storms together. Sister Williams was already at the organ, running through hymns with fingers that had played for New Hope services for 47 years. Deacon Roberts straightened chairs with the methodical precision of a man who'd been performing the same service every Sunday for over a decade. Dorothy, Sister Patricia's voice carried across the sanctuary as she approached with arms outstretched. As chair of the Mother's Ministry, Patricia had been my closest confidant during David's illness and death, understanding the particular burden of being the family matriarch when crises struck. We embraced with the warmth of sisters who'd prayed together through midnight hospital vigils and celebrated together at graduation ceremonies and wedding receptions. "How you been, sugar? You look tired." Patricia's observation was precise. The stress of discovering Melissa's theft had settled between my shoulder blades, creating tension that probably showed despite my efforts at composure. "Just got some things on my mind," I replied carefully. "Nothing the Lord can't handle." Pastor Williams approached the pulpit with the purposeful stride of a man who'd been delivering God's word for 32 years. His sermon began with familiar rhythm, congregational call and response that had comforted generations of worshipers facing trials that seemed insurmountable. "Church, there's a time for everything under heaven." He began, his voice carrying the resonant power that had helped build New Hope's membership from 200 to over 800 families. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. I found myself focusing intensely on his words, seeking guidance for the situation unfolding in my personal life. But church, there's also a time for justice, a time when the righteous must stand up and say no more, a time when protecting the innocent becomes more important than keeping the peace. Beside me, Ethan listened with the attention of a child raised in church, his understanding deeper than his years might suggest. At 12, he'd already learned that life contained complexities requiring adult wisdom, that sometimes good people faced difficult choices with no perfect solutions. As Pastor Williams continued preaching about divine timing and human responsibility, I made my decision. Melissa's theft wasn't just about money. It represented a violation of David's trust, a betrayal of the protection he'd tried to provide for his son even after death. The time for politeness and patience had passed. The time for justice had begun. After service, as Ethan ran off to join the other children in the fellowship hall, I approached Sister Patricia with careful deliberation. "Pat, I need to ask you something in confidence." I began, keeping my voice low despite the buzz of post-service conversation around us. "Of course, Dorothy. What's wrong?" I showed her the bank records on my phone, watching her expression shift from concern to outrage as she absorbed the implications of what Melissa had been doing. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "That woman's been stealing from David's baby for months, and if she's comfortable taking money, I'm wondering what else she might be doing that I don't know about." Patricia nodded grimly. "Dorothy, you know I got connections throughout the city. Folk who work in banks, insurance companies, legal offices. If you need to find out what else is going on, I can make some calls." The offer represented exactly what I'd hoped for without directly asking. The network of professional Black women who'd supported each other through decades of navigating predominantly white institutions, sharing information and resources to protect their families and communities. "I'd appreciate that more than you know," I said gratefully. As we prepared to leave church, collecting Ethan from a spirited game of basketball in the fellowship hall, I felt the familiar sensation of plans crystallizing in my mind. Teaching had trained me to think systematically, breaking complex problems into manageable steps while keeping the ultimate objective clearly in focus. Melissa had underestimated me, viewing a 68-year-old retired teacher as either too trusting or too afraid to challenge her directly. She'd forgotten that I'd spent 3 decades managing classrooms full of teenagers who tested boundaries professionally, that I'd raised 2 successful children while working full-time, and managing a household alone after my husband's death. Most importantly, she'd forgotten that I'd survived growing up in Alabama during the 1960s, navigating systems designed to exclude and exploit people who looked like me. $40,000 wasn't just theft, it was a declaration of war against my grandson's future. The war had begun, and Melissa was about to discover exactly what kind of opponent she'd chosen to face. Act 2. The investigation. Target, 1575 to 1750. Words, 9 to 10 minutes. Sister Patricia's connections proved more extensive than I'd anticipated. By Tuesday afternoon, my kitchen table had transformed into a command center, papers and printouts organized with the same methodical precision I'd once used for lesson planning. "Dorothy, you need to see this." Patricia's voice carried the weight of disturbing discoveries as she settled into the chair across from me, manila folder clutched against her chest. "My cousin Denise works in the mortgage department at First National. She pulled some records on David's house." I poured sweet tea from the pitcher I'd prepared that morning, the ritual of hospitality providing momentary calm before whatever revelation Patricia was about to share. Outside, the October afternoon carried the crisp promise of Chicago winter leaves beginning their transformation from green to gold. What did she find? Patricia opened the folder with deliberate care, spreading documents across my grandmother's oak table. Melissa took out a second mortgage on David's house 3 months ago, $68,000. The number hit like a physical blow. I set my glass down carefully, years of teaching unruly teenagers, having taught me to process shocking information without visible reaction. But my mind raced through implications that grew more disturbing with each passing second. David's house was paid off, I said quietly. The life insurance settlement cleared the original mortgage completely. I was at the closing myself. That's what made this possible, Patricia explained, pointing to highlighted sections on the loan documentation. Free and clear title meant she could borrow against the full equity value. Look at what she listed as the purpose. My reading glasses revealed the typed explanation: home improvements and childcare expenses. The lie was so brazen it took my breath away. David's house needed no improvements, and Ethan's care had been more than adequately funded through his trust distributions. There's more, Patricia continued grimly. Denise says Melissa's been shopping for refinancing options with 3 other banks. Each time she's listing higher and higher amounts. I leaned back in my chair, the scope of Melissa's scheme becoming clearer. She wasn't just skimming money from Ethan's trust. She was systematically converting every asset David had left behind into cash for her own purposes. Where's she putting all this money? That's what we need to find out next. Patricia reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts with practiced efficiency. I got somebody else needs to be in this conversation. 20 minutes later, Brother Malcolm Robinson knocked on my screen door with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to handling delicate situations. At 62, Malcolm had spent 35 years as an investigator for the Cook County State's Attorney Office before retiring to consult on financial crimes. More importantly, he'd been David's Little League coach when my son was 8 years old. Sister Dorothy. He greeted me with the formal courtesy that marked his generation of black men who'd navigated professional success in hostile environments. Patricia told me some troubling things about David's widow. We settled in my living room, the afternoon light casting long shadows across photographs chronicling 4 decades of family milestones. Malcolm's presence transformed our gathering from concerned neighbors sharing gossip into something approaching an official investigation. Show him everything, I said to Patricia, who began spreading documents across my coffee table with the organized precision of a woman who'd spent 40 years managing church committees. Malcolm studied each paper with the methodical attention I remembered from watching him teach young David the fundamentals of baseball. No shortcuts, no assumptions, complete mastery of available information before proceeding to the next step. This woman's been busy, he said finally, removing reading glasses with a gesture that reminded me painfully of David. Bank records show systematic small withdrawals to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. The mortgage documents indicate sophisticated knowledge of lending procedures. This isn't amateur hour. What do you mean? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Melissa's either getting professional advice or she's done this before. Malcolm's expression hardened with the look of a man who'd seen enough criminal behavior to recognize patterns. Nobody stumbles into this level of financial manipulation accidentally. The implications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with Chicago's October weather. If Melissa had been systematically stealing from other sources, if this represented part of a larger pattern, then Ethan's inheritance might be only the beginning of her crimes. Can you find out if she's done this before? Patricia asked, voicing the question I'd been hesitant to ask directly. Malcolm nodded slowly. I still got connections in various departments. Give me a few days to make some discreet inquiries. But Dorothy, you need to understand something important. He leaned forward with the serious expression I remembered from crucial conversations about David's future moments when adult decisions would shape a child's trajectory forever. If we're talking about fraud on this scale, we're not dealing with family court anymore. This becomes criminal investigation territory, federal crimes potentially. That changes everything about how you handle this situation. The weight of his words settled between us like a physical presence. I'd been thinking in terms of protecting Ethan's inheritance and ensuring Melissa faced consequences for her betrayal. But if Malcolm was right, we might be looking at something much larger and more dangerous. What should I do in the meantime? I asked. Document everything. Record every conversation with her if Illinois law allows it. And most importantly, don't let her know you're investigating. If she realizes you're onto her scheme, she might accelerate whatever timeline she's working toward. After Malcolm left, Patricia and I sat in my kitchen as afternoon faded into evening, the comfortable silence of a friendship spanning 3 decades, allowing us to process what we'd learned without immediate need for words. "You scared?" Patricia finally asked. I considered the question honestly. Fear had been my companion through many challenges. Fear when David was diagnosed with cancer. Fear during those long nights at the hospital when his condition deteriorated. Fear at his funeral when I realized Ethan's future rested largely in my hands. But this felt different. This was the focused determination I'd developed during my teaching career, when facing parents who tried to intimidate me, administrators who attempted to undermine my authority, or students who tested boundaries to see if I'd break under pressure. "Not scared," I said finally. "Angry. That woman is stealing from a dead man's child, and she's been doing it right under my nose for months. What you gonna do when Ethan gets home from school?" The question struck at the heart of my dilemma. Ethan was scheduled to spend the weekend at Melissa's house, the same arrangement we'd maintained since David's death. How could I send him into a situation where I now suspected his legal guardian might be systematically stealing his inheritance? "I can't tell him what's happening," I said slowly, working through the logic as I spoke. "He's 12 years old. He shouldn't have to carry the burden of knowing his mother is betraying his father's trust. But you can't pretend everything's normal neither." Patricia was right. Children possessed an uncanny ability to sense adult tension, especially children like Ethan, who'd already experienced significant loss and developed heightened sensitivity to environmental changes. "I'll keep him here this weekend," I decided. "Tell Melissa he's coming down with something needs rest and monitoring. Buy us a few more days to understand what we're dealing with." The plan felt reasonable until my phone rang at 6:30, just as I was starting dinner preparations. Melissa's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the careful neutrality I'd been practicing since Sunday's revelation. "Dorothy, I wanted to confirm pickup time for Ethan on Friday." Melissa's voice carried its usual brisk efficiency, no hint that she suspected I'd discovered her theft. "Actually, that's why I was planning to call you," I replied smoothly. "Ethan's been feeling under the weather since yesterday. Nothing serious, but I think he should rest this weekend instead of bouncing between houses." A pause that lasted just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "What kind of symptoms?" The question was sharper than necessary, almost suspicious. I found myself wondering if Melissa had developed the same heightened awareness that marked people engaged in deception, constantly scanning for signs that others might be watching them more closely. "Just tired, low appetite. You know how children can be when the weather changes. I'm probably being overcautious, but at his age, it's better to be safe." "I see." Another pause. "Well, I suppose that's probably wise. But Dorothy, I should mention that I've been meaning to discuss some changes in our arrangement." My grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of changes?" "I've been offered a position in Milwaukee. Better salary, more opportunities for advancement. The thing is, the start date is relatively soon, which would mean relocating within the next month." The announcement felt like ice water in my veins. If Melissa was planning to move Ethan to Milwaukee, she'd be removing him from my sphere of protection and influence. More troubling, a relocation would make it much harder to investigate her financial crimes or recover stolen money. "That's quite sudden," I managed to say. "Sometimes good opportunities have tight timelines," Melissa replied with what sounded like practiced explanation. "But don't worry about Ethan's transition. The schools in Milwaukee are excellent, and a change of scenery might be good for him. New start after everything that's happened this year." The casual dismissal of Ethan's established life, his friends, his school, his connection to his father's memory in Chicago, revealed depths of selfishness that took my breath away. But I forced my voice to remain calm and supportive. "We should probably discuss this in person," I suggested. There are practical considerations to address school records, medical files, that sort of thing. Of course. Why don't you come by the house tomorrow evening after Ethan's asleep so we can talk privately without worrying him unnecessarily? The invitation felt like a trap, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. Something in Melissa's tone suggested this conversation wouldn't be the collaborative discussion she was describing. That sounds fine. What time? 8:30. That gives me time to get Ethan settled and ready for bed. After ending the call, I immediately dialed Patricia's number, my hands shaking slightly as the full implications of Melissa's announcement settled in my mind. She's planning to take him to Milwaukee, I said without preamble when Patricia answered. Lord have mercy, within the month supposedly for a new job. Pat, if she gets him out of Illinois, it becomes much harder to protect him or investigate what she's been doing. You think the job's real? The question forced me to confront suspicions that had been growing throughout our conversation. I think she's gotten nervous about something. The timing feels too convenient right after she's stolen tens of thousands of dollars from his trust. Dorothy, you need to call Malcolm tonight. This changes everything about your timeline. As I dialed Malcolm's number, watching through my kitchen window as Ethan played basketball in the driveway with the unconscious joy of a child, still protected from adult betrayals, I realized our investigation had just transformed from methodical fact-gathering into an urgent race against time. Melissa was planning something bigger than I'd initially understood, and whatever it was, I had less than a month to stop her. Malcolm arrived at 7 the next morning, his usually composed demeanor replaced by an urgency that set my teeth on edge. I poured coffee into the mug David had given me for my 60th birthday, my hands steadier than they had any right to be given what Malcolm was about to reveal. Dorothy, sit down, he said, bypassing his usual courteous greetings. What I found changes everything. Ethan was still asleep upstairs, his Thursday morning routine delayed by the illness I'd fabricated to keep him home from school. The deception sat uneasily in my chest, but protecting him from the truth had become more important than maintaining perfect honesty. Melissa Reynolds isn't her real name, Malcolm began, spreading a folder across my kitchen table. Her birth name is Melissa Ann Garrett. She's got a record in Nevada stretching back 15 years. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, identity theft. She's done this before Dorothy, multiple times. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in an explosion of ceramic and liquid that seemed to echo through the house. I stared at the spreading puddle, my mind struggling to process what Malcolm had just revealed. She targeted David specifically. Looks that way. The pattern's consistent. She finds recently widowed or divorced men with assets, particularly those with children who might inherit significant money. Builds relationships, marries them, gains access to finances, then disappears when the resources are depleted. I closed my eyes, briefly remembering David's whirlwind courtship with Melissa 4 years ago. He'd been so happy, so grateful to find love again after his first wife's death from breast cancer when Ethan was only 3. I'd worried about the speed of their relationship, but attributed my concerns to natural maternal protectiveness. How many others? I asked quietly. 3 that I could verify. Probably more. The Nevada victim was an aerospace engineer widower with twin daughters. She cleaned out his retirement accounts and disappeared before the children turned 18. Filed reports. But she'd already moved on to California by then. And David never knew. Malcolm shook his head grimly. She's sophisticated. False identity documents, manufactured references, carefully constructed background story. Your son was targeted by a professional con artist. The revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about the past 4 years. David's marriage, Ethan's relationship with his stepmother, the financial arrangements that were supposed to protect my grandson's future. All of it built on lies so elaborate, I was still struggling to comprehend their scope. Malcolm, she invited me to dinner tonight, said she wants to discuss moving Ethan to Milwaukee for a new job. His expression darkened. Dorothy, you cannot go to that house alone. If she suspects you're investigating her, if she thinks you might expose her operation, you could be in real danger. I have to go. If I don't show up, she'll know something's wrong. And if I'm right about her timeline, this might be my only chance to gather evidence before she disappears with Ethan. We spent the next 2 hours developing a plan that felt more like preparing for military reconnaissance than visiting my grandson's legal guardian. Malcolm would position himself across the street with recording equipment and a direct line to police dispatch. I would wear a wire and carry a hidden camera with specific protocols for signaling if the situation became dangerous. Remember, Malcolm emphasized as he fitted the tiny recording device beneath my jacket collar, your primary objective is to get her talking about the money. If she admits to taking funds from Ethan's trust, we have evidence for fraud charges. If she reveals her real identity or mentions previous victims, even better. And if she gets suspicious, you leave immediately. Make up any excuse. Your safety is more important than evidence. By afternoon, word had spread through our church network with the efficiency that marked tight-knit communities. Sister Patricia arrived with Mother Jenkins and Deacon Williams, their presence transforming my living room into an informal war room where strategy merged with prayer. "Child, you sure about this?" Mother Jenkins asked, her 83 years of wisdom evident in every line of her weathered face. "Seems like you're putting yourself in harm's way when the police should be handling this situation." "The police need evidence," I explained, arranging the photographs Malcolm had provided from Melissa's previous crimes. "Right now, all we have are suspicions and circumstantial information. If she runs with Ethan before we can prove what she's done, it could take years to track them down." Deacon Williams, who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before joining the ministry, studied the surveillance equipment Malcolm had assembled. This recording device got good range. "Clear audio up to 50 feet, Malcolm confirmed. "And the camera's activated by voice command. Dorothy just has to say Ethan's father, and it starts recording." "What about backup?" Sister Patricia asked. "Suppose something goes wrong and Malcolm can't reach the police in time." I pulled out my phone and showed them the group text I'd created with Emma, Patricia, Mother Jenkins, and Deacon Williams. "Every 30 minutes, I send a status update. If you don't hear from me by 9:15, call 911 and tell them I'm in immediate danger." "Dorothy," Mother Jenkins said quietly, reaching across to take my hands in hers. "You know this ain't just about money. That woman's been living in your son's house, sleeping in his bed, raising his child under false pretenses. She defiled his memory and betrayed his trust. This is about justice for David as much as protection for Ethan." The older woman's words struck something deep in my chest, a place where grief and anger had been building since David's death. Melissa hadn't just stolen money. She'd stolen the peace he'd tried to provide for his son, corrupted the love he'd thought he'd found, turned his final years into a foundation built on lies. "I know," I said simply. At 6 o'clock, I called Melissa to confirm our meeting, practicing the careful neutrality that had become my shield over the past week. "Dorothy, I'm so glad you're coming over," she said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine warmth. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I believe this move could be wonderful for Ethan. A fresh start after such a difficult year. I'm sure you have his best interests at heart," I replied carefully, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Of course I do. He's my son now." The casual claim of maternal ownership delivered with such confident possession sent fury racing through my veins, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "I'll see you at 8:30. After ending the call, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at the photographs covering every surface. David at Ethan's Little League games, David teaching Ethan to ride a bicycle, David and Ethan building the treehouse that still stood in my backyard, a monument to a father's love and a son's trust. Melissa had no right to claim motherhood over that boy. She'd purchased access to his life through deception and maintained it through theft. But tonight, one way or another, her crimes would be exposed. At 8 o'clock, I drove through the familiar streets toward David's house, the recording device humming softly beneath my collar. Malcolm's van followed at a discreet distance and my phone buzzed with encouraging messages from the church network that had become my army in this fight for justice. The house looked exactly as it had during David's lifetime: meticulously maintained landscaping and warm light glowing from windows that had once represented safety and love. Now they felt like camouflage hiding the predator who'd invaded my family's sanctuary. Melissa answered the door wearing a navy dress that conveyed appropriate seriousness, her smile carrying just the right mixture of warmth and maternal concern. If I hadn't known her true identity, hadn't seen evidence of her systematic theft, I might have believed the performance entirely. "Dorothy, come in. I just put Ethan to bed so we can talk freely." She led me to David's study, the room where he'd spent countless hours working on client cases and helping Ethan with homework. The space felt violated by her presence, his books and photographs rearranged to accommodate her laptop, and financial documents spread across his desk. "Can I get you coffee, tea?" "Coffee would be nice." As she busied herself in the kitchen, I used the time to activate the hidden camera and survey the room for evidence of her crimes. David's filing cabinet stood open, financial documents visible inside folders that should have contained only legitimate household expenses. "Here we go," Melissa said, returning with 2 cups and settling into David's chair with casual familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Dorothy, I want you to know how much I've appreciated your help with Ethan since David's death. You've been wonderful with him. He's my grandson. I love him." "Of course you do, which is why I know you'll understand what I'm about to propose." She reached for a folder from David's desk, extracting documents with practiced efficiency. "The position in Milwaukee comes with significant financial benefits, but more importantly, it represents an opportunity for Ethan to start fresh. New school, new friends, distance from all the painful memories associated with this house and neighborhood. Ethan seems happy here. His friends, his school, his connection to his father's memory. Sometimes children don't know what's best for them," Melissa replied smoothly. "That's why they need adults to make difficult decisions on their behalf." She slid a paper across the desk toward me. "I've prepared a document transferring guardianship responsibilities solely to me. It would eliminate the need for continued coordination between us and allow me to make decisions about Ethan's future without outside interference." The document was professionally prepared, dense with legal language that would effectively terminate my legal relationship with Ethan while granting Melissa complete control over his inheritance. I forced myself to read carefully, buying time, while my mind raced through implications. "This gives you authority over his trust fund," I observed. "As his guardian, I would naturally make financial decisions in his best interest." Her voice carried a slight edge, the first crack in her maternal facade. "Dorothy, I should mention that I've discovered some irregularities in the trust management." The accusation hit like a physical blow. She was preparing to claim that I had been mismanaging Ethan's inheritance, turning my own investigation against me. "What kind of irregularities?" "Unauthorized withdrawals. Expenses that don't seem related to Ethan's care. I've documented everything for review by the appropriate authorities." The lie was so audacious, it took my breath away. Melissa was accusing me of the very crimes she'd been committing, creating a paper trail that would support her narrative if I tried to expose her theft. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," I said carefully. "Every withdrawal from Ethan's trust has been properly documented and approved by both trustees." "Perhaps. But appearances matter, especially when dealing with institutions responsible for child welfare. I'd hate for Ethan to be caught in the middle of an investigation into financial improprieties." The threat was clear. Sign over guardianship voluntarily or face false accusations that could result in Ethan being removed from both our care and placed in state custody while investigations proceeded. "Melissa," I said, buying time while trying to remember Malcolm's instructions for drawing out admissions, "help me understand something. If you move to Milwaukee with Ethan, how will you manage the financial aspects of his care, the trust distributions, education planning, that sort of thing?" "I'll handle everything locally. It's actually more efficient than the current arrangement." She leaned forward slightly. confidence replacing the earlier edge in her voice. "Dorothy, I should be frank with you. I've already arranged for consolidation of Ethan's assets into accounts I can manage directly. The trust structure David established is unnecessarily complicated for a child's needs." "You've already moved his money." "I've taken some preliminary steps to ensure accessibility," she confirmed. "Nothing inappropriate, just practical arrangements for a parent managing her child's inheritance." There it was. The admission Malcolm had said we needed, delivered with such casual confidence that Melissa clearly believed I posed no threat to her plans. "What about David's wishes?" I asked quietly. "He specifically structured the trust to protect Ethan's inheritance until he reached adulthood." Melissa's mask slipped, completely revealing the calculating predator beneath the maternal performance. "Dorothy, David is dead. His wishes are irrelevant compared to the practical needs of raising his son. I'm Ethan's mother now, and I'll make decisions based on current reality, not dead man's sentimentality." The casual dismissal of my son's love and protection for his child ignited something dangerous in my chest. But I forced myself to remain calm, knowing that Malcolm was recording every word of her confession. "I need to think about this," I said, standing to leave. "Of course. But Dorothy, I should mention that my timeline is firm. I need your decision by tomorrow evening. After that, I'll have to proceed with alternative arrangements." The threat was clear. Cooperate with her demands, or face the consequences of her false accusations and manufactured evidence. As I drove home through the dark Chicago streets, Malcolm's voice crackled through the radio he'd given me for emergency communication. "Dorothy, we got everything we need." Her admissions about moving the money, claiming unauthorized control over the trust, dismissing the legal structure David established. This is enough for fraud charges and emergency custody intervention. But even as relief washed over me, I realized our investigation had revealed something more disturbing than simple theft. Melissa wasn't just stealing money. She was systematically destroying every protection David had tried to provide for his son, replacing his love with her exploitation. The war for Ethan's future was about to begin in earnest, and now we had the weapons we needed to fight it. Friday morning brought Chicago's first snow of the season, fat flakes drifting past my kitchen window as I assembled the evidence that would destroy Melissa's carefully constructed life. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had loved the first snow, always the first to suggest building snowmen with Ethan or taking walks through Lincoln Park to watch the city transform into winter beauty. Malcolm spread photographs across my dining room table while Detective Sarah Washington, a lean woman whose reputation for financial crimes investigation had earned respect throughout the Chicago Police Department, reviewed the recordings from last night's confrontation. "Mrs. Carter, this recording is remarkable," Detective Washington said, removing her earbuds with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just heard a full confession. She admits to moving assets without authorization, dismisses the legal trust structure, and claims parental authority she doesn't legally possess. Combined with the bank records showing systematic theft, we have more than enough for felony charges. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, supposedly working on homework, but actually listening to every word with the focused attention that marked children who'd learned to monitor adult conversations for signs of approaching storms. I'd finally told him the truth. That morning, a careful explanation of Melissa's crimes that emphasized her choices rather than her identity as his stepmother. "What happens next?" I asked Detective Washington. "We execute a warrant for her arrest this afternoon. Financial crimes, identity theft, fraud against a minor, and custodial interference. The judge has already signed an emergency custody order transferring Ethan to your care pending resolution of criminal charges." The swift legal response felt almost surreal after months of growing suspicion and careful investigation. But I'd learned that authentic evidence, properly documented and professionally presented, could move through the system with remarkable efficiency. "Will she go to jail?" Ethan asked quietly, his first words since Detective Washington had arrived. "Very likely," the detective replied with gentle honesty. "These are serious crimes with substantial prison sentences attached." Ethan nodded slowly, processing information that would challenge any child's understanding of adult morality. She wasn't ever really my mom, was she? The question contained layers of loss that went beyond legal definitions. Ethan wasn't just discovering that his stepmother was a criminal. He was learning that the maternal love he'd thought he'd found after his biological mother's death had been performance art designed to access his inheritance. "She was never worthy of being your mom," I said quietly. "Your real mother loved you completely before she died. And your father loved you enough to make sure you'd always be protected and cared for." "By you," Ethan added with the simple clarity that marked childhood's ability to cut through adult complications. "By me," I confirmed. At 2 o'clock, Detective Washington called to report that Melissa had been arrested without incident at David's house, caught in the process of loading boxes into a moving truck parked in the driveway. The timing confirmed our suspicions about her accelerated timeline. She'd been preparing to disappear that very afternoon, taking Ethan and whatever remained of his inheritance to begin her next elaborate deception elsewhere. "Did she say anything?" I asked. "Denied everything initially. But when we showed her the Nevada records and played portions of your recording, she requested an attorney. Classic behavior for someone who knows they're caught." "What about Ethan's money? How much did she steal?" "Still calculating the total, but preliminary analysis suggests approximately $127,000 between the trust withdrawals and the mortgage on the house. We're working with federal prosecutors because some transactions crossed state lines." The amount took my breath away. More than twice what I'd initially discovered, representing years of security and opportunity, stolen from a child who'd already lost both his parents. "Can it be recovered?" "Some of it. She spent lavishly, but there are still recoverable assets. The house can be sold to repay the fraudulent mortgage, and we've frozen accounts where she deposited stolen funds. Ethan won't lose everything." That afternoon, as news of Melissa's arrest spread through our neighborhood and church community, my house filled with visitors offering support and expressing shock at revelations that transformed their understanding of David's widow. The woman they'd seen at church services and school events playing the role of grieving mother had been systematically stealing from the child she'd promised to protect. "I never trusted her," Mother Jenkins declared, with the satisfied vindication of someone whose instincts had been proven correct. Something about her always seemed false, like she was acting a part instead of living a life. "But she fooled David," Sister Patricia pointed out gently. "If she could deceive him, she could have fooled any of us." Emma arrived from Detroit that evening, having driven straight from the airport after receiving my phone call about Melissa's arrest. My daughter's presence brought both comfort and renewed perspective on the crisis we'd navigated. "Mom, I can't believe you went to that house alone," she said, embracing me with the fierce protectiveness that had marked her personality since childhood. "If anything had happened to you, Ethan would have lost everyone." "I had backup," I replied, gesturing toward Malcolm, who was organizing evidence files with the methodical precision that had made him successful during his law enforcement career. "Dorothy's been magnificent," Malcolm added. Cool under pressure, focused on the objective, never lost sight of what was really at stake. But even as praise washed over me from friends and family, I felt the weight of what we'd accomplished. Yes, we'd stopped Melissa's theft and protected Ethan from further exploitation. But we'd also shattered whatever illusion of maternal love had sustained him since his father's death. "How are you really doing with all this?" Emma asked Ethan, privately settling beside him on the living room couch, where he'd been quietly observing the adult conversations swirling around him. "I'm sad," he admitted with the simple honesty that marked children who'd learned early that life contained genuine tragedy. Not about Melissa going to jail because what she did was wrong, but about Dad choosing her, about him not knowing who she really was. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Your father chose based on the person Melissa pretended to be. He fell in love with a performance designed to deceive him. That doesn't make him foolish. It makes him a victim of a very sophisticated con artist. Like me," Ethan added quietly. "Like you," Emma confirmed. You're both victims of someone who specialized in exploiting decent people's capacity for love and trust. Saturday brought media attention as news outlets picked up the story of a professional con artist who'd targeted a recently widowed father and his child. Detective Washington had warned us about potential press interest, but I was still unprepared for reporters gathering outside my house or the sensation of our private family crisis becoming public entertainment. Mrs. Carter, how long did you suspect Melissa Reynolds was stealing from your grandson? A young woman with a microphone called out as I retrieved my newspaper from the front porch. No comment, I replied firmly, using the phrase Detective Washington had coached me to repeat to any media inquiries. But later that morning, Emma convinced me to watch the local news coverage of Melissa's arrest, arguing that we needed to understand how our story was being presented to the public. The news anchor's voice carried appropriate gravity as she described the case. Melissa Garrett, using the false identity Melissa Reynolds, is accused of stealing more than $127,000 from her 12-year-old stepson's inheritance after marrying his recently widowed father. Police say this represents part of a pattern of elder and child exploitation stretching back more than 15 years across multiple states. The report included a brief interview with one of Melissa's previous victims, an elderly man from Nevada, whose retirement savings had been drained before she disappeared. His story provided chilling insight into Melissa's methods and the devastating impact of her crimes on families struggling with grief and loss. She seemed like a godsend, the man said, his voice shaking with remembered betrayal. Someone who understood my pain and wanted to help me rebuild my life. I never suspected that my grief was just an opportunity for her to exploit. Watching his testimony, I realized how easily Melissa might have succeeded if we hadn't discovered her theft when we did. David's love for his son had been real, but it had also made him vulnerable to someone who understood how to manipulate parental devotion for criminal purposes. Sunday morning brought a different kind of reckoning as our church family gathered to process the shocking revelations about someone who'd been attending services and participating in community events for nearly 4 years. Pastor Williams devoted his sermon to the theme of discernment, the spiritual wisdom needed to distinguish between authentic relationships and manipulative performances. Church, we are called to love and trust, but we are also called to wisdom, he preached from behind the pulpit, where he'd delivered David's eulogy just over a year earlier. Sometimes evil presents itself wrapped in righteousness, speaking the language of faith while serving the purposes of greed. After service members approached me with mixtures of support and curiosity, their questions revealing how thoroughly Melissa had convinced everyone of her maternal devotion and grief over David's death. Sister Dorothy, she seemed so broken up about David's passing, Mother Williams observed. I remember her crying during his memorial service, talking about how much she missed him. Professional con artists are professional actors, Malcolm replied when I shared this conversation with him later. Melissa studied David's life, learned his values, understood his relationships, then crafted a performance designed to convince everyone she shared his love for Ethan. The tears were probably real, but they were tears of frustration at losing her primary source of income, not tears of genuine grief. Monday brought the preliminary court hearing, where Melissa, flanked by a public defender, entered not guilty pleas to all charges, while avoiding eye contact with me or Ethan. The woman who'd sat in my kitchen 3 nights earlier, confidently describing her plans to steal my grandson's inheritance, now appeared diminished and cornered. Your Honor, the prosecutor began. The defendant represents a continued flight risk given her history of assuming false identities and fleeing jurisdictions when her crimes are discovered. We request remand without bail. Melissa's attorney, a tired-looking man who'd clearly been assigned this case rather than choosing it, offered only token resistance to the prosecutor's arguments. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern of previous crimes undeniable, the risk of flight apparent to everyone in the courtroom. "Bail is denied," Judge Morrison announced with the finality that marked experienced jurists who'd seen enough criminal behavior to recognize genuine threats to public safety. "The defendant will remain in custody pending trial." As we left the courthouse, Ethan walked beside me with the subdued dignity that had characterized his behavior throughout this ordeal. At 12, he'd been forced to confront adult cruelties that would challenge people twice his age. Yet he'd maintained his essential kindness and trust in the family that remained to him. "Is it really over?" he asked as we reached the car. "The criminal part is mostly over," I replied honestly. "But the healing part, rebuilding our family and moving forward, that's just beginning. Will you help me understand why Dad didn't see what she was?" The question cut to the heart of Ethan's struggle to reconcile his father's judgment with Melissa's true nature. "Your father saw what Melissa wanted him to see because he was a good man who believed in love and second chances. She exploited his best qualities, not his weaknesses. Like she exploited mine," Ethan added with painful wisdom. "Like she exploited yours." "But Ethan, that doesn't make you foolish or weak. It makes you capable of love and trust, which are precious gifts. We just need to teach you how to protect those gifts while still keeping your heart open." As we drove home through Chicago streets, now free from the threat that had shadowed our family for months, I reflected on the justice that had been achieved. Not perfect justice, because Ethan's money couldn't fully be recovered and his trust had been damaged, but sufficient justice to protect his future and honor David's memory. Melissa would face the consequences of her crimes, not just against our family, but against all the families she'd betrayed over the past 15 years. The legal system, when presented with clear evidence and compelling testimony, had moved swiftly to protect a child from continued exploitation. More importantly, Ethan had learned that truth and justice were possible, even when confronting sophisticated evil. The adults in his life had worked together to protect him, proving that love was stronger than deception when people were willing to fight for what mattered most. The reckoning was complete. What remained was the careful work of rebuilding trust and moving forward together. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of the house that had become unequivocally ours, watching Ethan arrange his high school acceptance letters on the counter with the methodical pride of a young man who'd learned that achievements earned through honest effort carried special weight. At 14, he'd grown 6 inches and developed the quiet confidence that marked children who'd survived genuine hardship without losing their capacity for joy. "Northwestern sent a personal note," he announced, holding up the letterhead with barely contained excitement. "The admissions officer says my essay about financial literacy for families affected by fraud was one of the most compelling they'd read this year." I smiled, remembering the hours Ethan had spent crafting that essay, transforming his painful experience with Melissa's theft into advocacy for stronger protections for children's inheritance rights. Detective Washington had recommended him for a youth advisory board focused on preventing financial crimes against minors, and his insights had contributed to legislation now working its way through the Illinois General Assembly. "Your father would be so proud," I said, the words carrying less pain than they had 2 years ago. Time hadn't erased David's absence, but it had allowed his memory to become a source of strength rather than sorrow. Emma's voice carried from the living room, where she was assembling photo boards for the celebration dinner we'd planned. "Mom, did you include the picture from Melissa's sentencing? The one where Ethan's holding the victim impact statement he wrote," I called back. "It's in the David Memorial section." The sentencing had taken place 6 months earlier after Melissa pled guilty to 23 counts of fraud spanning 4 states and 15 years. Judge Morrison had sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, noting that her crimes represented a profound betrayal of the most sacred human relationships, and praising Ethan's courage in providing testimony that helped prosecutors understand the full impact of her deception. She wasn't just stealing money, Ethan had written in his victim impact statement. She was stealing my father's love and trust, turning his devotion to me into a weapon she could use to hurt us both. But she failed because real love doesn't disappear when criminals try to exploit it. Real love gets stronger when good people fight to protect it. The house felt different now, filled with authentic warmth, rather than the careful tension that had marked the months after David's death. We'd sold David's original house using the proceeds to pay off Melissa's fraudulent mortgage and establish a college fund that supplemented what remained of Ethan's inheritance. This smaller house in Hyde Park carried no memories of deception, only the accumulating history of a family that had chosen to rebuild itself around truth and mutual protection. Detective Washington arrived promptly at 6, bearing a bottle of sparkling cider and the official notification we'd been expecting. "Restitution payment came through this morning," she announced, setting an envelope on the counter. $78,000 recovered from asset seizures. Not everything, but enough to restore most of what was stolen. The money represented more than financial recovery. It symbolized the justice system's recognition that Ethan's inheritance deserved protection, and that criminals couldn't simply disappear with the fruits of their deception. Over the past 2 years, similar restitution had been paid to Melissa's other victims, creating a network of families who'd found closure through her prosecution. "There's something else," Detective Washington continued. "The FBI wants to interview Ethan for a documentary they're producing about financial crimes against children. His case has become a model for how families can work with law enforcement to expose sophisticated theft schemes." Ethan looked up from his acceptance letters with interest rather than anxiety. "Would it help other kids who might be getting stolen from—" "Absolutely. Your story demonstrates that children can be powerful advocates for their own protection when adults give them the tools and support they need." After Detective Washington left, we settled around the dinner table where so many crucial conversations had taken place over the past 2 years. Emma had prepared David's favorite meal, lasagna, with garlic bread and a salad featuring vegetables from the garden Ethan and I had planted in the backyard. The ritual honored his memory while celebrating the family we'd become in his absence. "I want to say something," Ethan announced as we prepared to eat. At 14, his voice had deepened and steadied, no longer carrying the uncertainty that had marked his 12-year-old self during the crisis with Melissa. "When Dad died, I thought my life was basically over. Not because I wanted to die, but because I couldn't imagine how anything would ever feel normal or safe again. Then Melissa started stealing from me, and I felt like maybe Dad had been wrong about people being basically good." He paused, collecting thoughts with the deliberate precision that reminded me so strongly of David. "But then Grandma Dorothy fought for me, and Aunt Emma flew in from Detroit to help. And Malcolm and Detective Washington and everyone at church worked together to protect me from someone who was trying to hurt me." "That's what family does," Emma said gently. "I know that now. But for a while I thought family was just something that could be taken away or destroyed by bad people. Now I understand that real family is something you choose to build and protect together, and that choosing to do right even when it's hard makes you stronger instead of weaker." The simple wisdom of his observation left me momentarily speechless. In 2 years, Ethan had progressed from victim to survivor to advocate, transforming his pain into purpose while maintaining the essential kindness that had made him vulnerable to Melissa's manipulation. "There's something I've been wanting to give you," I said, reaching for the envelope I'd placed beside my napkin earlier that evening. Inside was the deed to our house legally transferred to Ethan's name, with life estate provisions that allowed me to live there as long as needed while ensuring he would inherit property free from any potential future complications. "Grandma, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," I interrupted gently. "Your father wanted you to have security. This house represents that security, and knowing it belongs to you means no one can ever again threaten your stability for their own purposes." Emma smiled, understanding the deeper significance of the gesture. "Mom, you're teaching him that real strength comes from protecting others, not from accumulating power for yourself." As evening progressed into a comfortable family celebration with board games and stories about David and plans for Ethan's senior year of high school, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of quiet triumph. Melissa's conviction had provided legal justice, but the true victory lay in what we'd built together afterward. Ethan had learned that families could survive devastating betrayals and emerge stronger. I'd discovered that protecting those we love sometimes required fighting battles we'd never imagined facing. Emma had found a way to balance her demanding career with active presence in her nephew's life, creating stability across geographic distance. Most importantly, we'd proven that David's love and protection had been strong enough to survive even sophisticated criminal assault. The trust he'd established, the values he'd taught, the relationships he'd nurtured, all had contributed to our ability to recognize threat and respond effectively. "Grandma," Ethan said as we cleaned up after dinner, "do you think Dad would be proud of how we handled everything?" I considered the question while loading dishes into the dishwasher, remembering David's voice reading bedtime stories, his laughter at family dinners, his fierce devotion to his son's future happiness and security. "I think your father would be amazed by the young man you've become," I said finally. "You faced something that would challenge adults twice your age, and you came through it with your integrity and compassion intact. That's not luck, Ethan. That's character." "And you," he added with the directness that had always marked his communication style. "Dad would be proud of you too, for fighting for me when it was dangerous, for teaching me that love means protecting people, not just saying nice words." As we settled into our evening routines, Ethan working on homework at the kitchen table, while I prepared lunches for the following day, normalcy felt both precious and hard-won. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges and opportunities, rather than crises requiring adult courage from a child or grandmother strength from a woman who'd thought her child-rearing days were behind her. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of life continuing, healing, rebuilding from loss into something new and strong. Outside Chicago, winter was giving way to spring, and David's son was growing into the remarkable young man his father had always believed he could become. Justice had been served, family had been preserved, love had proven stronger than exploitation. The story was complete, but the life it had made possible was just beginning.